It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Mrs. Thompson walked into the local bank. She had visited this branch countless times before, always greeted by the friendly staff who knew her by name. At 72 years old, she wasn't one to create waves. She lived a quiet life in her small home, keeping busy with gardening, reading, and spending time with her children and grandchildren when they visited. For the most part, Mrs. Thompson's days were peaceful. She had worked hard all her life, and now in her retirement years she enjoyed a slower pace, managing her finances carefully and relying on her modest pension. That morning, Mrs. Thompson needed to deposit a check she had received from a government program. It was a simple task, something she had done countless times before. As she entered the bank, the sound of the automatic door whooshing open seemed louder than usual, and the air felt unusually tense. There weren't many people in line, just a few customers, most of them busy with their own banking. Mrs. Thompson made her way to the front desk where a young cashier greeted her, but there was something about the cashier's demeanor that felt off. "Good morning," Mrs. Thompson said with a warm smile as she approached the counter. The young cashier barely looked up as she took the deposit slip from Mrs. Thompson's hand. There was a flicker of impatience in her expression, but Mrs. Thompson thought little of it. She had seen young people rushing around in the bank before, and perhaps this cashier was just having a busy day. "Deposit?" the cashier asked briskly, her voice lacking the warmth that Mrs. Thompson had come to expect from the bank staff. "Yes, dear," Mrs. Thompson replied politely. "Just a simple deposit today." The cashier nodded, but instead of processing the deposit immediately, she started typing furiously on her computer. Mrs. Thompson stood there, waiting, trying not to let her growing unease show. She had been a loyal customer at the bank for years, and she had never been treated this way before. But maybe the cashier was just new, or maybe something was off with the system. Mrs. Thompson tried to shake off the discomfort she was feeling. It would pass, she thought. After a few moments of tapping away at the keyboard, the young woman looked up at Mrs. Thompson. Her face clouded with concern. "Ma'am," she said, her tone suddenly much sharper. "It looks like there's an issue with your account. You don't have enough funds to complete this transaction." Mrs. Thompson blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, dear, what do you mean?" "I've always had enough in my account." The cashier didn't seem to care about her concern. "Well, the system is showing that your account is under the minimum balance needed to complete a deposit. I can't process it." The older woman's heart sank. She had managed her finances carefully all her life. She had never been the type to overspend, and she certainly didn't miss payments. She tried to recall the details of her account. She knew she had recently received some money from the government, and she hadn't spent much recently. Something didn't add up. "I'm sure there's been a mistake," Mrs. Thompson said gently, trying to maintain her composure. "Could you please check again?" "I know I should have enough." The cashier gave her a blank look. "I've checked it twice. There's no mistake. You need to have a minimum balance of $100 in your account to make a deposit. It's right here on the screen." Mrs. Thompson felt the weight of embarrassment settle in her chest. The last thing she wanted was to be the center of attention, and now she could feel the eyes of the people in the line behind her. She wasn't a wealthy woman, but she had always prided herself on managing her money wisely. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. The cashier, seemingly uninterested in offering any further help, just stood there, waiting for Mrs. Thompson to do something about the situation. Mrs. Thompson could feel the heat rising in her cheeks as she struggled to come up with a solution. But before she could speak, the cashier added almost in a dismissive tone, "You really should keep better track of your balance. It's not my job to remind you." Mrs. Thompson was stunned by the coldness in the cashier's voice. How could someone be so rude? She didn't know how to respond. She had always been careful with her finances, and now she felt like she was being treated like an irresponsible child. Just then, a voice called out from behind her, "Is everything okay here?" Mrs. Thompson turned around and her heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway of the bank was a man who seemed to fill the room with his presence. It was none other than Vin Diesel, the famous actor known for his roles in action-packed movies. Mrs. Thompson was surprised to see him there. She had never expected to run into a celebrity in such an ordinary setting, let alone one who might come to her aid. Vin Diesel looked around the bank, his gaze falling on the tense exchange between Mrs. Thompson and the cashier. He noticed the elderly woman's discomfort and the coldness in the cashier's manner. Without hesitation, he walked over to her side. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his deep voice calm but authoritative. The cashier, clearly surprised by his attention, hesitated for a moment. "No, sir. Everything is fine," she said quickly, almost too quickly. But Vin Diesel wasn't buying it. Mrs. Thompson, who had been feeling small and powerless in the situation, suddenly felt a surge of relief. It wasn't that she needed a famous actor to stand up for her, but there was something reassuring about his presence. It was as though the world had just shifted and she wasn't alone in her discomfort anymore. Vin Diesel looked at Mrs. Thompson, then back at the cashier. "I don't think it's fine," he said calmly. "It looks to me like this woman is being treated unfairly. She's been a loyal customer for years and she doesn't deserve to be spoken to like that." The cashier blinked in confusion, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. She was about to respond when Vin Diesel turned to the manager, who had appeared at the front of the bank after hearing the exchange. "Is this how your staff treats customers?" Vin Diesel asked, his voice still calm but firm. The manager's face reddened as he assessed the scene. He glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who was now visibly shaken, and then at the cashier, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. "I'm terribly sorry," the manager said quickly, his tone apologetic. "Let me get this sorted out right away." Vin Diesel turned back to Mrs. Thompson, his demeanor softening. "Don't let them treat you like that," he said with a reassuring smile. "You deserve respect just like everyone else." For the first time since she had walked into the bank, Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of dignity return. The kindness in Vin Diesel's words, his unwavering support, made her feel seen, made her feel valued again. The bank manager, still flustered by the attention Vin Diesel had drawn to the situation, quickly stepped forward. His uniform was crisp and his expression was filled with an apology. But there was a sense of urgency in his voice now. "Ma'am, I truly apologize for the inconvenience," the manager said, his voice a stark contrast to the dismissive tone of the young cashier. He motioned for Mrs. Thompson to follow him. "Let's get this sorted out for you. We value your business and this shouldn't have happened." Vin Diesel, standing to the side, watched as Mrs. Thompson followed the manager to his office. His mind was spinning with the injustice he had witnessed. In a world that often felt too fast-paced and indifferent, moments like this reminded him of the importance of standing up for those who couldn't always defend themselves. It wasn't about being a celebrity or a figurehead. It was about basic decency. As the manager led Mrs. Thompson to the back office, Vin Diesel lingered in the lobby, his eyes fixed on the cashier. She stood there awkwardly, her eyes cast down as she fiddled with the pen in her hand. The awkwardness in the air was palpable. She knew she had made a mistake, but it seemed like she didn't quite know how to make it right. Vin Diesel knew that people often didn't change until they were confronted with the consequences of their actions. Sometimes all it took was a gentle reminder that we all had a responsibility to treat each other with kindness. The door to the manager's office clicked shut behind Mrs. Thompson and the bank manager, and Vin Diesel's attention shifted back to the other customers in the lobby. The room was quiet now, but it hadn't been long ago that the tension between Mrs. Thompson and the cashier had made everyone uneasy. Some customers were still eyeing the situation, unsure whether to speak up or continue with their transactions. As minutes ticked by, Vin Diesel found himself growing restless. He didn't like seeing people treated poorly, especially not in a setting where they were supposed to feel safe and valued. It wasn't about heroism. It was about treating people with the basic dignity they deserved. Eventually, the door to the manager's office opened, and Mrs. Thompson emerged, her face soft with relief. The manager followed her, looking somewhat embarrassed but also relieved that the issue was finally resolved. Mrs. Thompson walked toward Vin Diesel, her steps slower than usual, but she had a small smile on her face. "Thank you," she said to him, her voice shaky but filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Vin Diesel smiled back warmly. "I'm just glad I could help. No one should treat you like that. I'm happy it all worked out." The manager nodded, though his face still held a hint of discomfort. "I've made sure to fix the issue with your account," he said, his voice sincere. "You won't have any more problems. We also put a note in our system to ensure this doesn't happen again." Mrs. Thompson nodded in appreciation. She was no stranger to handling her own affairs, but the relief of having someone stand up for her was something she would always remember. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice steady now. but the warmth in her eyes said more than words ever could. As she made her way back to the counter to finalize her deposit, the young cashier stepped forward hesitantly. Her eyes met Mrs. Thompson's, and for a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. "I'm really sorry for the way I treated you earlier," the cashier said softly, avoiding Mrs. Thompson's gaze. "I was having a bad day and I took it out on you. That wasn't right and I should have handled it better." Mrs. Thompson looked at the young woman for a moment. The apology was sincere, but it didn't change the earlier humiliation. Still, Mrs. Thompson knew what it was like to make mistakes. She had made plenty in her own life, and sometimes it was important to offer people a chance to learn from them. "I appreciate your apology," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice kind but firm. "I know we all have tough days, but it's how we treat others that matters. Just remember, a little kindness can go a long way." The young cashier looked up at Mrs. Thompson, her eyes wide. It was clear she hadn't expected that kind of response. She had expected anger or bitterness, but Mrs. Thompson had offered understanding instead. "I will," the cashier said quietly. "Thank you for being so kind." Vin Diesel watched the exchange from a distance, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. He could see that the situation had shifted. The tension had melted away, replaced by a sense of calm. It wasn't just about fixing the problem. It was about healing the hurt that had been caused. Mrs. Thompson's grace had turned an uncomfortable moment into a learning opportunity, not just for the cashier, but for everyone in the room. As Mrs. Thompson completed her transaction, Vin Diesel turned to leave, his role in the scene over, but the impact of the moment still lingering in the air. "Take care of yourself," he said as he waved goodbye to Mrs. Thompson. "And don't let anyone make you feel small again." Mrs. Thompson smiled back at him. "I won't," she said. "Thank you again." Vin Diesel walked out of the bank, his heart a little lighter than it had been when he had first walked in. Sometimes it wasn't the big gestures that made a difference. It was the small moments, the quiet acts of kindness that had the power to change lives. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow across the street. It was a peaceful evening, and the world seemed to slow down for a moment. Vin Diesel paused on the sidewalk, taking in the calmness around him. He had helped someone today, but it wasn't just the act that mattered. It was the ripple effect that kindness could have. Back inside the bank, things had returned to normal. The young cashier was still behind the counter, but her demeanor had changed. She was calmer now, more thoughtful in her interactions with customers. The manager had returned to his office, his face still flushed from the earlier confrontation. But his confidence was beginning to return as well. As the day wound down, Mrs. Thompson left the bank with a renewed sense of peace. The discomfort and humiliation she had felt earlier had faded, replaced by the feeling that she had been heard. She had never expected someone like Vin Diesel to come to her aid, but it wasn't his fame that mattered in the end. It was the fact that he had seen her as a person, not just a customer. For Mrs. Thompson, it was a reminder that even in the smallest of moments, we had the power to make a difference. She had walked into that bank feeling vulnerable and small, but she left with her dignity intact and, perhaps most importantly, her belief in humanity restored. The next day, the story of what had happened at the bank spread through the town like wildfire. Mrs. Thompson had never been one to seek attention, but somehow her brief encounter with Vin Diesel had become the talk of the community. People who had been in the bank that day, including the customers who had witnessed the confrontation, couldn't stop talking about it. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing a movie star in their local branch, it was what he had done that had left everyone in awe. Some people had witnessed the interaction and were inspired by how calmly and kindly Vin Diesel had handled the situation. His message of respect and dignity resonated with many, especially those who had experienced the sting of being treated unfairly. It reminded people that it wasn't enough to just go through life passively. Sometimes we all had a responsibility to speak up for others. Mrs. Thompson, on the other hand, had spent the morning quietly at home. She had not expected such attention, and frankly, she wasn't sure how to feel about it. She had just gone into the bank to make a deposit, like she had done so many times before, but today was different. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had somehow been altered in that single moment. When she had found herself in need of help and unexpectedly received it from someone she had never imagined would be there. As the day went on, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but think about the young cashier. She had apologized and Mrs. Thompson had forgiven her. But the more she thought about it, the more she wondered if the cashier had learned anything from the experience. It was clear that the young woman hadn't meant to be rude or dismissive, but her actions had caused hurt. It was easy to imagine that she had just been overwhelmed, maybe dealing with her own stress or personal challenges, but that didn't make the way she treated Mrs. Thompson any less painful. Around noon, Mrs. Thompson decided to visit the bakery down the street to pick up a loaf of fresh bread. As she walked through the door, she was greeted by the owner, a woman who had been running the small shop for years. Mrs. Thompson had visited the bakery regularly, and she knew the owner well. "How are you today?" the bakery owner asked with a smile. "I'm doing fine, thank you," Mrs. Thompson replied, but there was a distant look in her eyes as she reached for the bread. "I heard about what happened at the bank yesterday," the owner continued, her voice low. "I just wanted to say, you've got a lot of people supporting you. It's nice to see someone stand up for what's right." Mrs. Thompson smiled weakly, appreciating the kind words, but she wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't expected so much attention, especially for something that had felt so personal. "I didn't do anything special," Mrs. Thompson said softly, her hands resting on the counter as she thought about the events of the day before. "I just tried to stay calm." The bakery owner nodded knowingly. "That's what makes it special," she said. "You handled it with grace. Not everyone can do that, especially when they feel hurt." As Mrs. Thompson left the bakery, she felt a warm sense of comfort. It seemed like people in the community were rallying around her, even if they didn't fully understand what had happened. She hadn't expected any of this attention, but she appreciated the kindness and support. When she returned home, she made herself a cup of tea and sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the birds outside. Her thoughts turned again to the young cashier. She wondered how the girl was doing. Mrs. Thompson had sensed some guilt in her voice when she had apologized, but guilt alone didn't always lead to change. She knew from her own life that growth took time. Meanwhile, at the bank, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The young cashier, who had been at the center of the controversy the day before, was back at her post. She was trying to go about her job as usual, but there was a noticeable unease in her movements. The other staff members had been talking about what happened, and many of them had approached her with sympathy, but also with a sense of disbelief. It wasn't every day that a customer's experience led to such a public reaction, especially one involving a celebrity. The cashier's manager had pulled her aside earlier that morning, explaining the gravity of the situation. "You can't treat people that way," he had said firmly. "It's important to remember that everyone comes to this bank with different experiences, different stories. Our job is to make them feel respected and valued, not belittled." The cashier had nodded, but she knew deep down that her behavior had been more than just a simple mistake. She had let her frustration and stress spill over onto an elderly woman who had simply come to do her banking. The guilt had weighed heavily on her all morning, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed an important opportunity to make a positive impact on someone's day. As the day wore on, she found herself thinking about Mrs. Thompson and the grace she had shown. Most people would have been angry, maybe even upset enough to demand to speak to a manager or leave the bank altogether. But Mrs. Thompson had chosen a different path. She had treated the cashier with kindness even when she had every right to be upset. The young cashier couldn't help but feel ashamed. She had acted out of impatience and had let her frustration dictate her behavior, but she didn't want to be that person anymore. She wanted to learn from this experience and become better, not just for her job, but for her own sense of integrity. By the end of the day, the young cashier made a decision. She would reach out to Mrs. Thompson. She wasn't sure if Mrs. Thompson would be open to hearing from her, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She sat down at her desk after her shift, took a deep breath, and wrote a heartfelt letter of apology. She explained that she was truly sorry for how she had treated Mrs. Thompson, and that she had learned a valuable lesson in kindness and respect. The next morning, as Mrs. Thompson sat down with her morning tea, she heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, so she was surprised when she opened it to find a letter in her mailbox. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to read. It was a letter from the cashier. Mrs. Thompson's heart softened as she read the words of apology. The cashier had explained that she had been going through a difficult time and that she had let her emotions get the best of her. She had written that she hoped Mrs. Thompson would forgive her, and that she would do better moving forward. Mrs. Thompson's eyes welled up with tears. She had always believed in the power of second chances, and here was living proof that people could learn from their mistakes. She sat for a moment, letting the weight of the letter sink in, then picked up her phone to call the bank. When she reached the manager, she asked if she could come in to speak with the cashier. She wanted to tell her in person that she had forgiven her. The manager, of course, was more than happy to arrange the meeting. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Thompson found herself back at the bank, standing in front of the cashier who had caused her so much distress just the day before. This time, though, the atmosphere was different. The young woman was nervous, but Mrs. Thompson could see the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you for your letter," Mrs. Thompson said, smiling gently. "I've forgiven you. We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we learn from them." The young cashier's face softened with relief, and she thanked Mrs. Thompson again, her voice sincere. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the fact that she had taken responsibility and had made an effort to grow from the experience. The two women stood there for a moment, exchanging a quiet understanding, before Mrs. Thompson turned to leave. As she walked out of the bank, she felt lighter than she had in a long time. The incident at the bank had been difficult, but it had also brought something positive into her life. The reminder that kindness, forgiveness, and understanding could change the course of a situation. And as for the young cashier, she had learned the lesson of a lifetime. It was easy to get caught up in the busyness of life, but every interaction was an opportunity to make a difference, for better or worse. Mrs. Thompson had shown her what it meant to handle a situation with grace, and now it was her turn to carry that lesson forward. The days following Mrs. Thompson's visit to the bank felt strangely peaceful. While the town had buzzed with excitement after the incident, Mrs. Thompson preferred to keep to herself. She wasn't one for attention or fanfare. She'd always believed that the best way to live was simply to be kind and do what was right, without expecting anything in return. But something had shifted in her. She had never anticipated that a small encounter at the bank could change the way she looked at the world and herself. When she had walked in, simply intending to deposit a check, she had left with much more than just a completed transaction. It had been a reminder that sometimes standing up for others and for yourself was the most powerful thing you could do. And in that moment, Mrs. Thompson had been the one to stand up for herself, but in a way that wasn't harsh or angry. It was an act of grace, something she had learned over the years. She had dealt with much worse in her life, but the way Vin Diesel had stepped in, and how he had treated her with respect, had made her realize how much she had been silently hoping for someone to see her, to acknowledge her worth. While she didn't expect to run into Vin Diesel again anytime soon, she would never forget his kindness. It had been one of those rare moments when a stranger becomes something more, someone who believes in you without ever knowing you. It had been enough to lift her spirits and to remind her of the good that still existed in the world. But life had a way of throwing curveballs when least expected. A week after her visit to the bank, Mrs. Thompson received a letter that made her pause. It was from the manager at the bank, and it was unexpected. The bank manager explained that following the incident, there had been some changes made within the staff. He shared that the cashier who had been involved in the situation with Mrs. Thompson had been reassigned to a different branch. It wasn't a punishment, the manager assured her, but more of a decision to give the young woman time to reflect and focus on improving her customer service skills. Mrs. Thompson had mixed feelings about the whole thing. On one hand, she understood that people needed opportunities to learn from their mistakes, just as she had learned to do in her own life. On the other hand, she couldn't help but wonder whether the cashier felt as though she had been punished unfairly. It was true that the cashier had acted in a way that was unkind, but Mrs. Thompson had believed from the moment she had received the apology that the young woman was capable of change. A single mistake should not define a person's entire career. The manager also mentioned in the letter that they had made efforts to ensure a similar situation wouldn't happen again. More training was going to be implemented across the board for the entire staff, focusing on how to handle customers with patience, understanding, and respect, especially those who might be older or more vulnerable. As she read the letter, Mrs. Thompson's thoughts drifted back to the events at the bank. She wasn't angry about the changes that had been made, but she did wish that people could be more forgiving. She had received an apology from the young cashier, and that was all she had wanted. Recognition that she had been wronged and a genuine effort to make things right. The world was already filled with so much judgment, and it seemed to her that kindness could go much further than punishment. A few days later, Mrs. Thompson found herself in town again, walking to the same bakery where she had bought her bread a week earlier. It had become one of her favorite spots, not just for the delicious treats but for the warm atmosphere that the bakery owner had created. She was greeted with a smile as soon as she walked through the door. "You look like you're in deep thought today," the bakery owner remarked. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Thompson chuckled softly, her fingers tapping gently on the counter. "I'm just thinking about the letter I received from the bank," she said. "It seems they've reassigned the young woman I had the issue with." The bakery owner raised an eyebrow. "Really, did they? That's surprising. You handled it so well I thought they'd just let it go." Mrs. Thompson smiled softly. "I thought so too, but I guess they decided it was a bigger deal than I did. I just don't want her to feel like she's been punished too harshly." The bakery owner considered this for a moment. "I think you're right. It's easy to forget that everyone has their own challenges. It's one thing to make a mistake, but it's another to be given the chance to learn and grow from it." Mrs. Thompson nodded. She had always believed that people should be given room to grow. She had made her share of mistakes in her life, but she had been fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who believed in her and gave her second chances. That had made all the difference. That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson felt the pull of the bank again. It wasn't a pressing need, it was more out of curiosity. She wondered what it would be like to see the young cashier again, especially now that some time had passed. Would she be the same person? Would her demeanor be different? She wasn't sure, but she decided to go. The bank was quiet when she entered. The soft hum of the air conditioning filled the background, and there were only a few customers in line. Mrs. Thompson walked toward the counter, her steps slow and deliberate. She wasn't expecting much. She simply wanted to observe. To her surprise, the cashier she had interacted with a week ago was standing at the counter, working quietly. She seemed a little more composed, but there was an air of hesitance around her, as if she were unsure how to behave. Mrs. Thompson paused for a moment. Gathering her thoughts, the young woman glanced up and, seeing Mrs. Thompson, her face turned pale. She took a small step back, clearly nervous. Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly, and in that moment the young woman seemed to relax slightly. "Hello," Mrs. Thompson said gently, her voice calm and inviting. "How have you been?" The cashier hesitated, but then a small smile appeared on her face. I'm doing better. I've been reassigned to another branch, but I wanted to thank you for your kindness last week. I don't think I've ever had anyone treat me the way you did. I know I messed up, but you showed me that I could do better." Mrs. Thompson smiled softly, her heart warming. "I'm glad to hear that. It's all about learning, right? We all make mistakes, but we also have the chance to grow from them." The cashier's eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll never forget how you handled everything." For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a quiet understanding between them, one that spoke volumes about the power of forgiveness and the importance of second chances. The young cashier had taken the lesson to heart, and Mrs. Thompson had given her the space to grow. As Mrs. Thompson walked out of the bank, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about how the experience had shaped both of them. They had both learned something important that day. The importance of kindness, patience, and most of all, forgiveness. The world had a way of testing people, but it also had a way of showing them the way forward, if they were willing to learn. Mrs. Thompson was content knowing that her small act of grace had made a difference, not just in her life, but in someone else's as well. In the days that followed, Mrs. Thompson found herself reflecting more on the incident at the bank than she had initially intended. It wasn't the attention or the letters that had come her way. It was the feeling of having made a difference. That feeling stuck with her long after the day at the bank, leaving her with a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. She was also aware of the quiet ripple effect her encounter with Vin Diesel had created in the town. People spoke about kindness and how one simple act could change the way they interacted with the world. It was humbling to realize that while she hadn't set out to be a symbol of grace, That's how others saw her. Mrs. Thompson had lived a simple life, one rooted in faith, family, and community. She wasn't one to seek attention or fame. She found comfort in small acts of kindness, like holding the door open for a stranger or offering a warm word to someone who looked troubled. But she had never expected her life to be entwined with someone like Vin Diesel, a man whose face had graced billboards and whose name had been whispered in the halls of Hollywood. Yet here she was, a woman from a quiet town, now at the center of a small whirlwind. She wasn't sure how to handle it, but she felt a deep sense of pride in the fact that she had stayed true to herself. When Vin Diesel had stepped into the bank, he hadn't seen her as just an elderly woman. He had seen her as a person, and in turn she had done the same. She hadn't expected anything from him, but his kindness had struck her deeply. It wasn't just that he was a celebrity. It was that he had treated her with the same dignity and respect that anyone deserved. Meanwhile, the young cashier, whose actions had set the chain of events in motion, continued to work at the bank. She was still assigned to a different branch, but she had kept in touch with Mrs. Thompson, and every time they spoke, she expressed her gratitude. It seemed that slowly but surely she was finding her way. Her letters were filled with apologies and reflections on how much she had learned from their encounter. Mrs. Thompson had taken it all in stride. The cashier's transformation wasn't something that could happen overnight, but the young woman had shown genuine remorse and had made strides toward being a better person. One morning, as Mrs. Thompson walked to the mailbox, she noticed something different. Her neighborhood, usually calm and quiet, felt alive with anticipation. She couldn't help but wonder what had changed. It wasn't until she reached the post office that she understood. There was a small crowd gathered in front of the building, all eagerly looking at something or someone who had appeared. It was Vin Diesel. He had returned to the town, and this time he wasn't just passing through. He was there to speak at an event for charity, one that was organized to support local youth programs. The event was taking place that very afternoon, and the whole town was buzzing with excitement. Mrs. Thompson hadn't been expecting to see him again, but here he was, the man who had changed her life in such a quiet, yet profound way. As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Thompson walked to the front of the building, curious to catch a glimpse of him. She didn't know if he would remember her, but as she approached, Vin spotted her. His face broke into a warm, familiar smile. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted her, extending his hand. "It's so good to see you again." "Vin, it's nice to see you too," she replied, shaking his hand with a genuine smile. "You know, I've been meaning to thank you properly for what you did," Vin said, his voice sincere. "You really taught me something that day about patience and respect. You were calm when I would have been frustrated." Mrs. Thompson smiled, her heart warming at his words. "I just try to do what I think is right," she said. "Sometimes the right thing is just to stay calm and let things work themselves out." "I'll remember that," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "It's easy to let things get to you, but staying composed, that's something I want to do more of." The two of them stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. It was as if the world had paused, allowing them this brief moment of connection. And in that moment, Mrs. Thompson realized something. It wasn't just the celebrity or the event that mattered. It was the way that people, no matter their background or status, could make an impact on each other's lives. Vin had taught her that just as she had taught him. The event itself was wonderful. Vin's speech was heartfelt, focusing on the importance of community, kindness, and giving back. He spoke about his own experiences and how the lessons he had learned through his career and life had shaped the man he had become. It wasn't a performance or a scripted speech, it was real, raw, and inspiring. Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel proud of him, proud that he had used his platform to make a difference. After the event, there was a small reception, and Mrs. Thompson found herself sitting at a table with a few people she knew from the town. They spoke about the speech, the local youth programs, and of course the surprising turn of events that had led to this moment. As they talked, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. A simple visit to the bank, a chance meeting with a celebrity, had sparked a series of events that had led to something much greater. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the community, about people coming together to help one another. She had seen firsthand how kindness could ripple outward, affecting the lives of so many others, and that to her was the greatest reward of all. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Thompson decided it was time to leave. The town was still buzzing with excitement, but she felt content. She had seen enough, and now it was time for her to go home. As she walked down the street, the cool evening air wrapped around her, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. She had done her part in making the world a little bit kinder, and that was enough. When she returned home, she sat down with a cup of tea and took a moment to reflect. It wasn't just the event or the interaction with Vin Diesel that had stayed with her. It was the realization that change could happen in the smallest of moments. A single act of kindness, a simple conversation, could create a chain reaction that spread far beyond anything one person could imagine. And in that moment, Mrs. Thompson knew that her work was far from over. She would continue to be kind, to show patience, and to always extend a hand to those who needed it. Because after all, that's what life was all about, making the world a little brighter one person at a time. Life, as Mrs. Thompson had always known, had a way of unfolding in the most unexpected ways. The events of the past few weeks had taught her something profound. Change often came when you least expected it, but it was the choices you made in the moment that truly shaped the outcome. The small town where she had spent most of her life felt more alive than ever. The community had come together in ways that surprised even her. The event organized by Vin Diesel had sparked a renewed sense of unity. People who had never spoken before were now helping each other, sharing resources and creating opportunities for those who needed it most. It was as though the kindness that had started with a single act, an elderly woman standing up for herself in a bank, had rippled through the community, causing a chain reaction of goodwill. Mrs. Thompson had always believed in the power of community. Growing up in a small town, she had learned early on that people were what made a place feel like home. Neighbors helped each other, shared meals, and supported each other in times of need. But she had also seen the challenges that came with small-town life, the judgments, the gossip, the way people sometimes isolated themselves from others. It was easy to get caught up in the day-to-day struggles, but the kindness she had witnessed recently reminded her of the simple truth she had always known. People could make a difference in each other's lives. As the days passed, Mrs. Thompson found herself more involved in the town's activities. She had become a regular at the local community center, where people gathered to discuss ways to improve their neighborhood and support the youth programs that Vin Diesel had highlighted during his speech. The energy was contagious, and she couldn't help but feel inspired by the passion of the younger generations, who were eager to create positive change. One afternoon, Mrs. Thompson was sitting on a bench at the community center, enjoying the sunshine, when she noticed a young man walking by. He looked familiar, and as he got closer, she realized that he was the same cashier who had been involved in the incident at the bank. His name was Jake, and he seemed a little nervous as he approached her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice shaky. I hope it's okay that I'm here. I just wanted to thank you again for everything. I've been working hard on myself, and I've learned so much from you." Mrs. Thompson looked up at him and smiled warmly. "Jake, it's good to see you," she said, patting the space next to her on the bench. "Please, sit down." Jake hesitated for a moment, but then sat down beside her. "I've been trying to make things right, you know. I know I messed up, and I'm trying to learn from it. It's not easy, but I'm working on it." "I know you are," Mrs. Thompson said kindly. "It's not about perfection. It's about trying every day to be better, to do better." Jake nodded, his expression softening. "I never realized how much a simple act of kindness could change everything. When you stood up for yourself that day at the bank, it made me think about all the times I've taken people for granted. It's not just about doing my job. It's about respecting people no matter who they are." Mrs. Thompson's heart warmed as she listened to him. "That's a good lesson, Jake, and I'm proud of you for learning it. It's never easy to admit when we're wrong, but it's the first step toward becoming the person we want to be." Jake's eyes brightened. "Thank you. I've been trying to help out more at the community center, volunteering and being part of the events. I want to show people that I'm serious about making a change." "That's wonderful," Mrs. Thompson said, beaming. "You're on the right path, Jake. Just keep doing the right thing even when it's hard. The more you give, the more you'll receive." The two of them sat there in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching as children played in the park nearby. It was a peaceful scene, and Mrs. Thompson felt a deep sense of gratitude for the way things had turned out. Life was unpredictable, but the kindness of strangers and the willingness to forgive had created a ripple effect that was now shaping the future of the community. As the days went on, the town continued to thrive. The youth programs flourished, and more people came forward to volunteer their time and resources. The spirit of generosity and kindness that had started with a single act of grace was now woven into the fabric of the town. Mrs. Thompson was proud to be a part of it all, though she often found herself stepping back and letting the younger generations take the lead. She had seen enough to know that they were capable of great things. One afternoon, as she was walking to the community center, Mrs. Thompson ran into someone else she hadn't expected to see, Vin Diesel. He was standing outside the building talking to a group of volunteers, and when he saw her, he immediately excused himself and walked over to her. "Mrs. Thompson," he exclaimed, smiling. "It's good to see you again. How's everything been?" "Everything's been wonderful," she said, smiling back. "The town's really come together. There's a lot of energy here now." Vin nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've noticed that. It's amazing how a single spark can light up a whole community. You're the spark, Mrs. Thompson. You showed people that kindness matters, that it's never too late to change." Mrs. Thompson chuckled softly. "I just did what I thought was right. But I'm glad to see that others are following suit. I think we're on the right track." "I think so too," Vin agreed. "And I'm proud of you. You've done something many people wouldn't have the courage to do. You stood up for yourself and for others." "It wasn't easy," Mrs. Thompson admitted. "But sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing to do. I didn't expect any of this, but I'm grateful for the changes that have come." "I'm grateful too," Vin said, his eyes reflecting sincerity. "You've taught me more than you know, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me always." As the conversation continued, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. The journey she had been on, one that had started with a simple, ordinary visit to the bank, had led her to places she never expected. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the way people could come together and make the world a little bit better, one kind act at a time. When the event ended that evening, Mrs. Thompson returned home, feeling a deep sense of peace. She had done what she could, and now it was time for others to carry the torch. She knew that the community would continue to grow, evolve, and thrive, because at the heart of it all, kindness had been the catalyst for change. And as she sat in her favorite chair, sipping her tea, Mrs. Thompson smiled to herself. She knew that, no matter what the future held, the lessons she had learned and the kindness she had shared would remain a part of her story forever.